A midnight feast ends in betrayal. Who struck at the table? Welcome to Wolfe's Casebook. I am your host, Mr. Enigma. Share your location in the comments. I love seeing where you're from. This community means everything. Now, the banquet begins. The first stirrings of trouble arrived in the brownstone on a Tuesday evening, uninvited, as trouble usually does. Fritz was in the kitchen orchestrating one of his 5-course feasts, the kind that required a symphony of saucepans and a degree of reverence usually reserved for organ music. Wolfe was in his chair, of course, dictating a letter with the precision of a surgeon and the warmth of a stone statue. And me? I was at my desk pretending to type, but actually keeping an eye cocked for the knock I knew was coming. You do this long enough, you recognize the sound of disruption before it arrives. There's a pause in the air, a sense of someone rehearsing their courage on the stoop. When the bell finally rang, Wolfe sighed through his nose and snapped, "Archie." I went. Standing on the doorstep was a man who looked as if he'd been carved from old mahogany and dressed by a tailor who liked secrets. His tuxedo was impeccable, but his expression had the desperate glaze of someone watching a soufflé collapse. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, which told me he'd done his homework. "My name is Lionel Ashcroft. I require a consultation with Mr. Wolfe. It is urgent." That word has many flavors. This one was seasoned with panic, garnished with shame. I let him in. Ashcroft carried with him a faint perfume of truffles and power. He was a noted gourmet. His face had appeared often enough in society pages, always hovering over some gleaming banquet table, carving pheasant with the pride of a king. He was the patron behind half the fashionable restaurants in Manhattan, and the target of envy for the other half. Wolfe did not rise when we entered. He merely gestured at the red leather chair opposite his desk, his eyes half-lidded, voice flat. "State your business." Ashcroft sat, smoothed his lapels, and tried to muster dignity. "Mr. Wolfe, you are acquainted with my annual midnight banquet?" "I am acquainted with its vulgarity," Wolfe replied. "A carnival of ostentation, attended by dilettantes who confuse appetite with spectacle. What of it?" Ashcroft flushed but pressed on. "This year's banquet is to be held Friday night. It is the pinnacle of the season. Chefs flown in, courses conceived as art, invitations sought like holy writ. But—" he hesitated, then leaned closer. "I have received a threat. An anonymous letter. It claims the banquet will be sabotaged, humiliated, unless I pay an impossible sum. It warns of disgrace." Wolfe grunted, a sound of distaste more than surprise. "Blackmail through cuisine. Barbarous." Ashcroft's hands twisted together. "I cannot cancel. The press would devour me. My rivals would crow. The banquet must proceed. But if this threat is real, if some outrage occurs, my reputation will not recover. Mr. Wolfe, I beg you, protect the banquet. Find the culprit before they strike." Now, if Wolfe has a creed, it's that he doesn't beg and he doesn't run. He especially doesn't budge for pageantry. But I saw something flicker in his eyes, the faintest glint that told me he was interested despite himself. Not because of Ashcroft's plight. Wolfe had little patience for social vanity, but because the sanctity of food itself was at stake. Sabotage in the kitchen is, for him, a species of sacrilege. "You brought the letter?" Wolfe asked. Ashcroft produced it. Cream paper, typed, unsigned. "Pay $50,000 in unmarked bills, or watch the banquet curdle into infamy." Wolfe took it between 2 fingers as though it were something unclean. He studied the paper, the typeface, the folds. "Childish," he murmured. "But mischief in a kitchen can wound more deeply than bullets in a duel." He let the letter fall to his desk. "I accept." Ashcroft sagged in relief. "Thank you. You will attend the banquet?" Wolfe's lips twitched. "Certainly not. Mr. Goodwin will observe. I will direct from here." Interlopers will find my brownstone impregnable, my chair immovable. But if they seek to defile food, they will discover their folly." Ashcroft frowned, but desperation overcame pride. "As you wish. I will provide Mr. Goodwin with full access." When he left, Wolfe reached for the beer Fritz had just set down and took a long draught. "Archie," he said, "we are trespassed upon. To profane a banquet is to profane civilization itself. Prepare yourself. You will attend." I nodded. "And while I'm there, what exactly am I looking for?" He closed his eyes. "Watch the kitchens. Watch the guests. Appetite reveals character more clearly than confession. Somewhere among Ashcroft's glittering parasites lurks a saboteur. Find them before the feast begins." That was the hook. Trouble had walked in wearing a tuxedo and carrying a letter, and Wolfe had taken the bait. Not for the man, not for the money, but for the principle. The sanctity of food had been challenged, and in Wolfe's world, that was enough to turn a banquet into a battlefield. Lionel Ashcroft's shoes hadn't even finished clicking down the steps outside before Wolfe reached for the letter again. He pinched it as though it was some exotic insect specimen, turning it in the light from the desk lamp. His lips compressed into that thin line that meant his brain was already juggling a half-dozen variables. "Archie," he said, "note the folds. 3. Equidistant, inserted into a standard envelope, not large. The typist used a machine with uneven ribbon wear. See here, the faint impression on the second O in food. And the phrasing, curdle into infamy, is vulgar melodrama. Not the work of a professional extortionist, likely an amateur. That increases the danger." "Because amateurs don't know when to quit?" I asked. "Because amateurs," Wolfe replied, "cannot resist demonstrating their cleverness. A professional would simply demand and vanish. An amateur will linger to witness the spectacle of their sabotage. That means they will be present at the banquet." Which meant my weekend had just been donated to Wolfe's crusade against culinary vandalism. The following morning I set about preparing for a society banquet as only Archie Goodwin can. Polished shoes, pressed suit, eyes sharpened for the crowd I knew would gather like vultures around Ashcroft's midnight table. Fritz fussed over my tie, declaring it inadequate for a room full of gourmets, while Wolfe dictated instructions from his chair as though commanding an army. "You will observe the kitchens," he said. "Identify any unfamiliar staff. Saboteurs gain entry through disguise. Waiters, scullions, even delivery men. Watch the guests. Envy and resentment dine more heavily than appetite. Most of all, Archie, you will note who observes most keenly when food is served. The guilty will crave the moment of defilement." "I'll keep my eyes peeled," I promised. That evening, Ashcroft's estate glowed against the Manhattan skyline like a jewel dropped carelessly on velvet. The mansion's windows blazed with light, its driveway crowded with sleek cars and sleeker egos. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of truffles, saffron, champagne, and ambition. Ashcroft greeted me at the door, his tuxedo starched, his smile brittle. "Mr. Goodwin, you are Wolfe's eyes tonight." "Eyes, ears, and occasionally feet," I said. "Relax. If anyone tries to slip arsenic into your consommé, I'll notice." He gave a nervous chuckle and ushered me inside. The banquet was a spectacle. A string quartet hummed in the corner while uniformed staff glided about with silver trays. Guests draped in silks and diamonds murmured in low tones, their laughter brittle, their eyes sharp. I recognized half a dozen names from the gossip columns. Restaurateurs, critics, patrons with enough money to import a chef along with their caviar. But my attention was on the kitchens. I slipped back to the service hall, flashing Ashcroft's approval letter, and found a hive of activity. Chefs in tall hats stirred copper pots, apprentices chopped with frantic precision, waiters lined up like soldiers awaiting orders. I made mental notes. The head chef was French, tall and humorless, barking orders in a clipped accent. The pastry team moved like dancers. The scullions worked with eyes downcast. No obvious intruder, but I knew better than to expect an amateur saboteur to wear a mask marked villain. Returning to the dining hall, I circulated among the guests, notebook disguised as a program in my pocket. I caught snippets of conversation, each revealing more ego than appetite. "That fool Ashcroft thinks he can crown himself emperor of cuisine," sneered one restaurateur. "Ashcroft's banquets are vulgar displays," whispered a critic. "If they falter, perhaps the city will look to subtler palates." "Ashcroft ruined me once," muttered a man in the corner, his glass clenched too tight. I would relish seeing him ruined in turn. And there it was. Motive was as plentiful as champagne. Half the room had reason to see Ashcroft humbled. The trick would be spotting which one had the gall to act on it. The first course arrived. An amuse-bouche of quail egg, caviar, and edible gold leaf. The guests sighed with pleasure, but I scanned the room for eyes that watched not the food, but Ashcroft's reaction. I caught a flicker, a young woman at the far end, a journalist I recognized from society columns. She smiled too broadly, her pen poised above a notebook, watching Ashcroft rather than her plate. The second course came. Consommé with black truffle. Again I watched. A man in a dark suit, heavy-set with a thick mustache, barely touched his spoon, but his eyes darted constantly toward the kitchen doors. He was waiting for something, not savoring. The third course, lobster poached in saffron, arrived without incident. But during the fourth, I noticed a disturbance. A waiter carrying a tray of venison stumbled, nearly spilling, then recovered too quickly. His eyes met mine for an instant, and something in them glittered wrong, too sharp, too deliberate. I followed him discreetly as he disappeared into the service hall. Back in the kitchen, the man slipped behind a stack of crates. I moved closer, my hand near my pocket where my revolver rested. He fumbled with something, paper. No, a small vial, glinting in the light. He was about to tip it into a saucepot when I closed the distance. "Drop it," I said, my voice low but hard. He froze, then bolted. I lunged, grabbed his arm, twisted. The vial clattered to the floor, rolling harmlessly under a counter. Chefs shouted, knives flashed, pots spilled. But I held him, dragging him back into the dining hall where Ashcroft's glittering guests gasped in horror. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, "I bring you tonight's uninvited course, a saboteur with more vinegar than brains." Ashcroft's face went white, then red. "Who are you?" he demanded of the man. The waiter spat, his accent betraying him. "I am truth. You gorge while others starve. Tonight was your lesson." I held him fast until Ashcroft's guards arrived to take him away. The guests buzzed, scandal sizzling like fat on a grill. Ashcroft tried to recover his poise, raising his glass. "A minor disturbance," he declared. "The banquet proceeds." But the night's flavor had shifted. I excused myself, heading to the study to phone Wolfe. He listened silently as I reported. When I finished, he spoke in that slow, precise tone that told me he was already dissecting the evening. "Archie, you have secured the vial." "Yes, clear liquid. Smells faintly of almonds." "Cyanide, most likely," Wolfe said. "Amateur, but lethal. Bring it here. And Archie." This waiter was not alone. Amateurs crave audience, but also guidance. Someone among the guests set the stage. We must identify the director, not merely the actor. That meant the game was far from over. I pocketed the vial, glanced once more at the glittering, unsettled crowd, and knew Wolfe was right. The midnight banquet had only begun its betrayal. Ashcroft's midnight banquet might have staggered back onto its golden rails after the little sideshow with the vial, but anyone who thought the evening was saved needed their eyes checked. Guests laughed too loudly, forks clinked too nervously, and more than one pair of eyes kept sliding toward the kitchen doors as if expecting a second act. Ashcroft himself wore a smile stretched tighter than Fritz's strudel dough, raising his glass with forced bravado. I've seen men bluff at poker with less strain. I left the glittering circus to its courses and returned to the study where I could phone Wolfe in peace. He answered with his usual grunt, which doubles as both greeting and complaint. I gave him the rundown: suspicious waiter, vial, almonds, cyanide. Wolfe didn't interrupt once, though I could picture him leaning back, eyes half closed, letting the pieces arrange themselves like a chess problem. When I finished, he asked one question. Describe the waiter. Average height, wiry, dark hair. Accent vaguely Eastern European, but he overplayed it. Too obvious. Clothes looked borrowed, not on Ashcroft's staff. That much was clear. Indeed, Wolfe said. And his declaration? Something about truth and teaching Ashcroft a lesson for gorging while others starve. Wolfe snorted. Self-righteous drivel. He was a pawn, Archie, not the hand that moved him. A saboteur who declaims in public is no saboteur at all. He is theatre. The true culprit is concealed, relishing the spectacle. Which leaves me with a ballroom full of suspects and no script, I said. Your task, Wolfe replied, is to observe who benefits. The waiter is but a symptom. The disease is ambition or envy. Identify which guest leaves tonight stronger if Ashcroft is diminished. Report to me at once. That was Wolfe's way of saying, don't come home until you have more than a vial of poison and a bruised wrist for your trouble. I slipped the vial into my pocket and returned to the dining hall. The fifth course had just been served, duck confit with cherry glaze. It looked divine, but most guests were pushing food around their plates rather than savoring it. Fare does strange things to appetite. I took my time circulating, ears tuned for tremors under the chatter. I stopped near the journalist I'd noticed earlier, the one with the too bright smile. Her pen scratched eagerly across her notebook, her gaze flicking constantly to Ashcroft. She caught me watching and arched a brow. Quite the drum, she said. Your employer's intervention saved the night, I suppose. Or postponed the curtain fall, I said. You seem awfully ready to write Ashcroft's obituary. Got your lead already? She smirked. Scandal sells, and Lionel Ashcroft is ripe for it. He's made enemies in every kitchen from here to Paris. Did you know he once bankrupted a rival just to poach their chef? I hadn't, but I stored it away. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. If tonight collapses, half this room will toast the ruin, the other half will publish it. I moved on, but her words clung like burrs. Near the fireplace, I found the heavy-set man with the mustache who hadn't touched his consommé. He was laughing too heartily with a pair of restaurateurs, but his eyes kept skimming the room, restless. I introduced myself, and he gave a name, George Malvern, a critic of some minor journal that puffed itself up as an arbiter of taste. He gripped my hand with clammy fingers. Marvelous evening, don't you think? He said, though his glance darted again toward the kitchens. Marvelous if you enjoy cyanide with your salad, I said. His smile faltered. Funny thing, Mr. Malvern, you don't seem especially hungry. He chuckled nervously. Just watching my waistline. Then you're in the wrong business, I told him. His laughter didn't reach his eyes. I left him sweating and drifted toward the bar. A man stood there nursing whiskey with the tenderness of a priest at communion. Mid-40s, scar on his chin, eyes hooded. He looked vaguely familiar, though I couldn't place him. When I asked the bartender, he whispered, Victor Dane used to own Le Vrai Goût until Ashcroft outbid him for the lease. Ruined him. There it was. Another motive. By this point, I was practically tripping over them. The courses paraded on, each more elaborate than the last, and with each one I noticed the same thing Wolfe had predicted. The guilty weren't eating. They were watching. Every slip of a waiter, every hesitation from a chef, every nervous glance from Ashcroft, they soaked it in like critics at a flop. By the time dessert appeared, a tower of spun sugar and chocolate truffles, I had a notebook full of suspects and not a single clean lead. The waiter with the vial was in police custody by then, whisked away before the pastry course. But his presence raised more questions than it answered. Who had smuggled him in? Who had given him access to the kitchens? And most importantly, who would have benefited if he'd succeeded? The banquet ended with brittle applause. Guests departed in glittering clumps, whispering behind their hands. Ashcroft shook hands mechanically, sweat glistening on his brow. When I approached to take my leave, he clutched my arm. "You stopped him," he said. "You saved me." "Don't thank me yet," I told him. "That waiter wasn't the main course. Someone here tonight wanted more than a spectacle. They wanted you broken. Until Wolfe finds out who, you're still on the menu." He shuddered, then pressed a card into my hand. "Come tomorrow. I'll give you access to my files. Menus, staff lists, correspondence, whatever you need. Just find them." Back at the brownstone, I laid the vial on Wolfe's desk like an offering to some cranky deity. He peered at it, sniffed cautiously, and declared it cyanide indeed. Then he leaned back, steepled his fingers, and closed his eyes. "Report," he commanded. I gave him the full rundown: journalist with the sharp pen, critic with the clammy handshake, rival restaurateur with the scarred chin, half a dozen guests with motives as thick as Ashcroft's gravy. Wolfe listened in silence, the only movement the slow flex of his fingers. When I finished, he opened his eyes. "Pfui," he said, "a surfeit of suspects. The banquet was bait. The waiter was a decoy. We must sift motives not by resentment, but by audacity. Who among them had the arrogance to believe they could orchestrate such a spectacle and remain unseen? And how do you suggest we narrow that down?" I asked. He closed his eyes again. "You will visit Ashcroft tomorrow, collect the lists, speak to his staff. I will consider the psychology of gluttony. Appetite unmasks ambition," which meant Wolfe was settling into his chair while I went hunting. Typical. Still, as I left him to his beer and his orchids, I couldn't shake the feeling that the banquet had been only an appetizer. The true feast, the conspiracy Wolfe had smelled behind the truffle oil and champagne, was still to come. And judging by the faces I'd seen that night, there were plenty of hands eager to serve it. The next morning started with Fritz clattering in the kitchen, sending up aromas that would make a monk reconsider his vows. Wolfe was already in his chair, swaddled in yellow silk, dictating to no one in particular. I had my coffee, my notebook, and the faint aftertaste of last night's spectacle clinging to me like cigar smoke. At 9 on the dot, Ashcroft called. His voice was thin, cracked at the edges. "Mr. Goodwin, I trust you'll be punctual. 11 o'clock, my townhouse. The files will be ready." "I'll be there," I told him and hung up. Wolfe's eyes opened like shutters. "Attend carefully, Archie. Ashcroft's files may reveal much, or nothing. We seek not menus, but motives. The orchestration of sabotage requires access, yes, but more importantly, it requires vision. Someone conceived this act not to kill, but to humiliate. Remember that." "I'll keep it in mind," I said, finishing my coffee, though I'm partial to paper trails. They don't lie as easily as people. By the time I arrived at Ashcroft's townhouse, the man himself looked as if he hadn't slept. His hair was disheveled, his tie loose, and his eyes darted like a rabbit's. He ushered me into a study where stacks of ledgers, envelopes, and neatly bound menus covered the desk. "All correspondence with staff and suppliers," he said. "Every invitation, every approval. My reputation hangs by a thread, Mr. Goodwin. Find the hand holding the scissors." I flipped through the piles. Checks to wine merchants, letters from chefs begging for inclusion, invoices from florists and printers. Buried beneath the bureaucratic drivel were notes scrawled in pencil, reminders to call this critic, to charm that donor. Ashcroft lived half his life trying to appease people who hated him. One folder caught my attention. Personnel lists, waiters, cooks, porters. The names were familiar, but I looked for discrepancies. Sure enough, 3 names were crossed out, replaced at the last minute by temporary staff from an agency. The waiter with the vial could have slipped in that way. "Who approved these replacements?" I asked. Ashcroft rubbed his temple. "My maître d', Jules. He insisted on it. Someone had fallen ill, another was delayed, and we were desperate. The agency provided substitutes." "Give me the agency's name." He handed me a card. I pocketed it, then moved on to another stack, letters from critics. One envelope was torn, the note inside scrawled in venom, "Your banquets are grotesque pageants. The city will tire of your gluttony." Signed, Victor Dane. I whistled softly. "Your rival doesn't hide his feelings." Ashcroft grimaced. "Dane is bitter. I took his restaurant's lease, yes, but only because he defaulted. He blames me for his ruin. He would see me destroyed." "Maybe he tried," I said. But Wolfe's warning echoed in my head. The true culprit would be cleverer than a bitter rival scribbling nasty notes. Humiliation, not revenge, was the flavor of this plot. I left Ashcroft pacing in his study and headed to the agency. It occupied a cramped office above a laundromat, smelling of starch and ink. The clerk behind the desk looked up nervously when I showed him my license. 3 waiters last night at Ashcroft's banquet," I said. "Names, addresses." He shuffled papers, stammering. We sent 2, not 3. A misunderstanding, perhaps. Their names, Pierre Collet and James Fuller. Good men, no complaints." "And the 3rd?" His brow furrowed. "No record." That was enough for me. Someone had inserted a phantom into Ashcroft's staff without the agency's knowledge, which meant access to Ashcroft's inner circle. Back at the brownstone, I laid the findings before Wolfe. He listened, eyes half closed, fingers drumming. When I finished, he opened them slowly. "Elementary," he said. The waiter was planted not by the agency, but by someone with influence over Ashcroft's operations. The maître d', Jules, approved the substitution. But why? Loyalty to Ashcroft? Hardly. More likely, loyalty to another. "Like Victor Dane," I suggested. "Perhaps. But Dane lacks subtlety. He threatens openly. The true author of this conspiracy would not sign his venom. He would savor anticipation. He would place his piece on the board and wait." At that moment, the doorbell rang. Fritz answered, and a moment later ushered in Saul Panzer. Wolfe had summoned him, of course. Saul sat, expression as calm as a winter pond. "You'll shadow Jules," Wolfe said. "Ascertain his movements, his associates, his communications. Report without delay." Saul nodded, rose, and vanished like smoke. Wolfe leaned back. "Archie, we are closing the circle. The saboteur craves spectacle. They will not stop at one act. Another attempt will come, bolder, crueler. We must be ready." I frowned. "You think they'll try again?" "I'm certain," Wolfe said. "The banquet was but rehearsal. The true performance is still to come." That night, as Fritz served squab in brandy sauce, Wolfe barely touched his plate, which told me the gravity of the thing. He sipped his beer, stared into the distance, and muttered about appetites. By the time I turned in, I knew one thing for sure. The midnight banquet betrayal wasn't finished. Somewhere in the glittering maze of critics, rivals, and staff, a puppeteer still tugged strings, and when they pulled next, Wolfe intended to be the one cutting the wires. Saul Panzer could have followed a ghost through a snowstorm and returned with its shoe size, so I didn't doubt his ability to handle Jules. Still, while he was off shadowing the maître d', I had to keep the home front lively. Wolfe, as expected, spent the morning surrounded by orchids and silence, broken only by Fritz's footsteps and the occasional grunt when a beer reached his hand later than he liked. My job was to line up more threads for him to weave. I started with Ashcroft. He had promised me full access to his files, and though I'd already scooped the most obvious nuggets, Wolfe wanted deeper digging. The agency card was one thing, but I wanted to hear from the staff themselves. So around noon, I dropped back into Ashcroft's townhouse. He was in worse shape than the day before, hair sticking up like he'd tried to wrestle the ghost of Brillat Savarin. "Goodwin," he croaked. "Have you found them?" "Not yet, but we're picking up their scent. I'll need to speak to Jules directly. Where is he?" Ashcroft hesitated, eyes flicking toward the dining room. "Jules has taken a sudden leave of absence. Family emergency?" he said. "Left this morning." That lined up too neatly with Wolfe's instincts. Did he leave a forwarding address? Ashcroft shook his head. "Just gone. I assumed you knew." I kept my face steady, but inwardly my pulse picked up. If Saul was tailing him, fine. If not, then our keyhole into the conspiracy might have bolted. Back outside, I phoned the brownstone. Wolfe answered with his curt, "Yes." "Jules took off this morning," I said. "No matter," Wolfe replied. "Mr. Panzer is competent." He followed him. I breathed easier, though Wolfe's calm grated. It always did when I was running my shoes thin while he digested tidbits in his chair. Still, that was the game. Next on my list was Victor Dane. The scar-chinned rival had a grudge as thick as his whiskey. I found him at a dingy bistro on the east side, nursing a glass of red as if he couldn't afford to refill it. He spotted me the second I walked in, eyes narrowing like a man facing his debt collector. "What do you want, Goodwin?" he growled. "Answers," I said, sliding into the chair opposite. "You sent Ashcroft a poison pen letter. Now someone tries to poison his banquet. Doesn't look good." Dane barked a laugh, bitter as burnt coffee. "If I wanted Ashcroft ruined, I'd use the press, not cyanide. He's his own worst enemy. A few more years of gluttony and arrogance, he'll collapse without my help." "Maybe, but the timing's lousy." Dane leaned forward, eyes bloodshot. "Listen, he stole my lease, yes, ruined me. But I still have some pride left. Sabotage is for cowards. If I wanted him dead, I'd challenge him in the open." That sounded honest, or at least honest enough. Still, I left Dane's sour face with a note in my head. Too obvious a suspect. Too loud. Wolfe's voice echoed. "Subtlety, Archie. The true hand works in silence." By late afternoon, Saul checked in at the brownstone, and I hustled back to hear the verdict. Wolfe was waiting, hands steepled, eyes closed, like some oversized owl digesting a mouse. Saul's report was crisp. Jules took a cab downtown, met with a woman at a cafe near Union Square, mid-30s, dark hair, sharp features. They spoke for 20 minutes. Then she handed him an envelope. He pocketed it, left. I followed him to a boarding house. He's still inside. "Describe the woman," Wolfe said. "Could have been a journalist," Saul replied. "Carried a notebook." That got my attention. The woman matched the one I'd noticed at the banquet. The journalist with a smile too bright for the room. Wolfe's eyes opened slowly. "So, the Maître D receives instructions from a scribe. Fascinating." "Why a journalist?" I asked. "Sabotage doesn't make headlines unless someone writes them." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "Consider, Archie, a critic ruins with words, a rival ruins with finance. But a journalist, she ruins with narrative. What greater triumph than to create the scandal she then records?" It was elegant, sinister, and plausible. I pictured her smirk at the banquet. The gleam in her eye when she hinted Ashcroft was ripe for scandal. She wasn't just observing, she was staging her story. "Saul," Wolfe continued, "continue to observe Jules. Do not intervene. Archie, you will pay a call on this journalist. Probe gently. She will not confess, but her pride will betray her." So that evening I found myself in a modest walk-up where her byline glowed on the mailbox. Eleanor Vance. She opened the door in a blouse too crisp for comfort and eyes that measured me like I was an hors d'oeuvre she might or might not sample. "Mr. Goodwin," she said smoothly. "I wondered when you'd come." "You make it sound like a date," I replied. "Mind if I step in?" She gestured with a little smile. Inside, her apartment was cluttered with papers, clippings, half-filled notebooks. Headlines about Ashcroft screamed from every wall. Gluttony as art, the emperor of extravagance, Ashcroft's golden fork. It wasn't admiration. It was dissection. "You've made him your hobby," I said. "My subject," she corrected. "Ashcroft embodies the city's appetite. His rise tells a story. His fall will tell a better one." "That's convenient," I said, "since someone tried to write him out permanently last night." Her smile didn't flicker. "You caught that poor waiter, didn't you? Tragic, but scandal feeds itself. Ashcroft will never escape it now. Unless we find who staged it." She tilted her head. "And you think that's me?" "I think you like stories too much to let them happen naturally." She laughed softly. "Careful, Mr. Goodwin. You make me sound dangerous." "Wolfe says danger often comes in silk gloves," I told her. For a moment, her eyes sharpened. Then she looked away, rearranging papers on the desk. "Ashcroft is a parasite. He exploits chefs, ruins rivals, and feeds the city's shallow hunger. If he falls, it's justice, not crime." That was close enough to a confession for me. I left before she could sharpen her tongue further. Back at the brownstone, I reported. Wolfe listened, expression unreadable. At last, he said, "Vanity is more poisonous than cyanide. Miss Vance has arranged her narrative. Jules is her accomplice, the waiter her pawn, but she will not stop until her climax is staged." "And what's her climax?" I asked. Wolfe closed his eyes. "Ashcroft's complete ruin. The banquet was only prelude. She intends another act, one that will end him utterly." The room felt suddenly colder. Wolfe raised his glass of beer, sipped, and added, "We must be ready, Archie. The next course is coming." The morning after my visit to Eleanor Vance, the brownstone felt more like a war room than the sanctuary of a lazy genius. Wolfe wasn't pacing. He never paces. But his silence had the density of thunderclouds, and even the orchids seemed to lean away from him. I gave him the full replay of her words, tone, and every flicker of expression I'd catalogued. When I finished, he tapped a finger against his chair arm, eyes half shut. "She admitted enough," he said finally. "Not guilt, but intention. Miss Vance is no common criminal. She's a dramaturge. She engineers calamity to suit her narrative. Jules is her instrument, the waiter her expendable overture. But she has not yet reached her crescendo. The question is not whether she will act again, but how." "Good," I said. "That means we can stop her before she scripts the next act. You've got Saul on Jules. Want me to lean on Vance a little harder?" "Pfui," Wolfe muttered. "You would only provoke her. Restraint, Archie. She must believe herself unseen until I summon her. What we require now is anticipation. What stage has she prepared for her second act?" I suggested checking Ashcroft's calendar. If Vance wanted spectacle, she'd need another banquet, gala, or dinner to ruin. Wolfe inclined his head, which is as close as he gets to praise, and sent me off. Ashcroft wasn't pleased to see me so soon, but fear is a good motivator. He fumbled through his schedule and produced a gilt-edged card. "Saturday evening," he said. "A private tasting for select critics. Only 12 guests. It is meant to redeem me after last week's fiasco." "Or bury you," I said. His hand shook as he offered me the guest list. Names leapt out, critics, patrons, rivals. And yes, Eleanor Vance. "Why invite her?" I asked. "I could not refuse," he muttered. "She commands the column inches. Exclude her and the papers crucify me before a dish is served." I brought the list back to Wolfe. He examined it, nodding slowly. A smaller audience, more intimate, more devastating. If she strikes at this tasting, the scandal will be surgical. We must act. That afternoon, Saul phoned in. Jules had met Vance again, this time at a publisher's office. The envelope passed between them was thicker, and Jules left with a purposeful stride. Saul tailed him to a warehouse where deliveries for caterers were stacked high. Jules vanished inside. "He's moving pieces," Saul reported. "Then we must see the board," Wolfe said. He dispatched me to the warehouse with Saul for backup. The place stank of flour, fish, and damp wood. We slipped in through a side door, sticking to shadows. Jules was there, speaking with two men in aprons. They weren't waiters. They had the bulk and stance of men used to heavy lifting. One handed Jules a crate marked Saffron, Valencia. He pried it open just enough for me to glimpse glass vials glinting under the spice. Poison again, maybe worse. Jules paid them cash, stuffed the crate into a cart, and left. Saul's eyes met mine. He murmured, "He's setting up for Saturday." We tailed him back to the boarding house. Saul promised to keep watch through the night. I returned to Wolfe, who listened without visible surprise. "Excellent," Wolfe said. "Now we know the form. Sabotage through ingredients. She means to ruin Ashcroft, not with a clumsy waiter, but with his own food. If the critics collapse from tainted saffron, the scandal will be biblical." "Then we grab Jules before Saturday," I said. "No," Wolfe countered, voice sharp. "Premature. Arrest Jules, and Miss Vance escapes untouched, free to write her libel unopposed. No, we wait. We watch. And at the tasting, we intervene. At the precise moment to expose her. It must be public, incontrovertible, dramatic. Only thus will her narrative collapse." "Which means," I said grimly, "I'll be sitting at that tasting, playing target." "You will," Wolfe said, "and you will ensure every detail reaches my ears. There will be no second chance." The next 2 days were a blur of preparation. Saul shadowed Jules, reporting his every move. He confirmed the crate had been moved to Ashcroft's kitchen, hidden among legitimate supplies. I arranged discreet protection around the house, but kept it invisible. Wolfe insisted nothing must spook Vance. Fritz polished knives he had no intention of using in anger, muttering about the desecration of food. Wolfe drank more beer than usual, which is saying something. Saturday arrived cold and sharp. I dressed in my best, pocketed my notebook, and headed to Ashcroft's townhouse. The dining room glowed with candles, crystal, and nervous laughter. Ashcroft greeted his 12 guests with a smile stretched thinner than filo pastry. Critics murmured, rivals preened, and at the far end, Eleanor Vance sat with her notebook open, eyes gleaming. The courses began. First, an amuse-bouche, safe. Then a delicate soup, safe. Wolfe had instructed me to watch Jules. He hovered near the kitchen, sweat gleaming on his brow, waiting. By the fourth course, a saffron risotto, I saw it. Jules carrying a copper pot, his hand trembling. He ladled portions, eyes darting to Vance. She scribbled in her notebook, lips curling. That was my cue. I stood, glass raised. "A toast," I declared, "to our gracious host, and to the purity of his kitchen." All eyes turned. I reached the pot in 2 strides, dipped a spoon, and pretended to taste. My face stayed neutral, though the aroma of almonds teased my nose. I slammed the spoon down. "Poison," I said loudly. Chaos erupted. Ashcroft staggered back. Guests gasped. Chairs scraped. Jules dropped the ladle with a clatter. Eleanor Vance's pen froze in mid-scratch, her smile vanishing. Police arrived within minutes. I'd arranged that part. Jules was seized, protesting innocence. The critics clamored. Ashcroft nearly fainted. Vance sat very still, her notebook sliding closed. Back at the brownstone that night, I reported everything to Wolfe. He listened in silence, then finally opened his eyes. "Tomorrow," he said, "we summon them, all of them, Ashcroft, Jules, Miss Vance, and any other parasite who nibbled at that banquet. Here, in this room, we will hold our own feast, not of food, but of truth. And Miss Vance will discover that narrative, like appetite, can devour its author." He drained his glass. "Archie, inform Inspector Kramer. Prepare the office. The culmination approaches." I nodded, already picturing the brownstone crowded with suspects, Wolfe at his desk, the air thick with tension. The real banquet was yet to come, and Wolfe was sharpening his knives. Not for cooking, but for words. By the time Sunday morning rolled around, the brownstone was humming like a hive preparing for war. Not that Wolfe moved a muscle more than usual. He sat square in his chair, wrapped in his robe, as if this was just another lazy day. But the atmosphere was different. Fritz clanged pans with more force than finesse, and Saul had already reported twice before breakfast. Even the orchids upstairs seemed to sense Wolfe's concentration, standing straighter under his gaze. I'd spent most of the night writing notes for Kramer, who'd come barging in around dawn, chewing his cigar as if it were the throat of whoever had given him indigestion. He listened to my summary of the banquet fiasco and the saffron risotto stunt, scowled, then stomped into the office to argue with Wolfe. It was the usual duet. Wolfe refusing to share more than crumbs, Kramer demanding a full loaf. Eventually, Wolfe shut him down with a single sentence. "Inspector, you will attend this evening. I will present the culprit to you." That was all. No explanation, no elaboration. Kramer grumbled but agreed, because for all his bluster, he knew Wolfe's batting average was near perfect. When he left, Wolfe closed his eyes, satisfied. "Archie," he said, "arrange the gathering. Ashcroft will resist, but insist. Miss Vance will feign indignation, but she cannot resist the climax of her own drama. The others are merely decoration. Invite them, for the tableau must be complete." So I spent my day dialing, cajoling, and threatening in equal measure. Ashcroft nearly wept on the phone, whining that he couldn't endure another spectacle, but I told him Wolfe had the solution to his nightmare. That shut him up. Jules, still in custody, was delivered under Kramer's reluctant supervision. And Eleanor Vance? She laughed when I told her. "Of course," she said. "I wouldn't miss the final act." That laugh stayed with me. It had the confidence of someone who thought she still held the pen. By 6 that evening, the Brownstones' office was rearranged for battle. Wolfe sat at his desk, flanked by the globe and the bookshelves like a general surveying maps. The red leather chairs were arranged in a semicircle facing him, each polished armrest catching the lamplight. Fritz had provided coffee for the guests. No beer for them, only Wolfe's prerogative. Saul lingered in the corner, eyes steady, ready for anything. And me? I had my notebook, my wit, and the pleasure of stage managing the whole circus. They arrived one by one, Ashcroft first, wringing his hands, face pale, then the critics and restaurateurs muttering suspicions at one another. Kramer stomped in with Jules, who looked more like a whipped dog than a maitre d'. Finally, Eleanor Vance appeared, poised, lips curved in that faint smile of hers, notebook tucked under her arm. She sat with the air of someone attending a performance she already knew the ending of. Wolfe waited until the room settled into uneasy silence. Then he began, his voice low but resonant. "You are here," he said, "because a crime was attempted. Not of murder, though poison was the instrument, but of humiliation. Mr. Ashcroft's banquet was to be transformed into scandal. A narrative carefully constructed, with pawns placed on the board, so that the ruin of a man might be consumed as spectacle." Ashcroft winced. Vance's pen scratched across her notebook. Wolfe's eyes flicked to her for the briefest second, then returned to the group. "The waiter with the vial," Wolfe continued, "was not the author. He was but a fool, convinced to act by promises or ideology. The true architect remained hidden, feeding him lines, arranging his entrance. Similarly, the risotto debacle, saffron laced with cyanide, was staged not by Jules alone. He, too, is but a tool. Jules began to protest, but Kramer barked at him to shut up. Wolfe didn't even glance his way. The question, therefore, Wolfe said, is who profits by such a spectacle? Not financially, though rivals may sneer. No fortune is gained by ruined risotto. The profit here is in narrative, in the written word, in the triumph of pen over plate. Every eye shifted toward Eleanor Vance. She met the gaze calmly, as if she'd expected nothing less. "You accuse me," she said, her voice cool. Wolfe inclined his head. "I do. You, Miss Vance, sought not merely to report on scandal, but to create it. You embedded Jules as your agent, ensuring access. You armed him with poisoned saffron, confident that the collapse of critics in Ashcroft's dining room would crown your career with infamy. You meant to pen the story as both author and witness. That is your crime." Vance laughed softly, the sound curling like smoke. "An imaginative theory, Mr. Wolfe, but hardly proof." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Proof? You desire proof? Very well. Archie." That was my cue. I opened my notebook and read aloud from the transcript I'd copied after my visit to her apartment. Her exact words, "Ashcroft embodies the city's appetite. His fall will tell a better story." Her handwriting matched the notes Saul had photographed when he shadowed her. Her conversations with Jules observed twice, and the envelope stuffed with cash he had received, currently in Kramer's possession, bearing her publisher's insignia. The silence after my recital was thick enough to chew. Ashcroft gaped, the critics murmured. Kramer's cigar nearly fell from his mouth. Vance, however, didn't flinch. She straightened, smoothed her skirt, and said, "So I am guilty of wanting a story. Is that a crime?" "Yes," Wolfe said, his voice rising just enough to still the room. "When the story is manufactured with poison, when human lives are jeopardized, when reputations are destroyed not by truth but by contrivance, then it is a crime. You confuse journalism with authorship, fact with fantasy. You sought to create calamity rather than record it. That is not art, Miss Vance. It is villainy." For the first time, her composure cracked. The smile faltered. Her eyes flicked toward Jules, who sagged in his chair, head bowed. Kramer slapped his knee. "That's enough for me. Vance, you're coming with us." She rose, chin high, and let herself be escorted out. As the door closed behind her, Wolfe exhaled heavily and reached for his beer. The others drifted away in murmurs, leaving only Ashcroft, trembling with relief. "You saved me," he whispered. Wolfe gave him a glance of pure disdain. "Pfui, you are not worth saving, but food was, civilization was." Ashcroft didn't understand, but I did. The sanctity of the banquet, the preservation of cuisine against spectacle, that was what had moved Wolfe from his chair. When the house finally cleared, Wolfe sipped his beer, eyes closed. "Archie," he said, "remember this. Appetite reveals more than hunger. It reveals vanity, ambition, folly. Miss Vance mistook her appetite for destiny, and now she will dine on her own ruin." I closed my notebook, letting the silence settle. Another case finished, another villain outmaneuvered. The brownstone returned to peace, as it always did, with Wolfe immovable, Fritz preparing dinner, and me ready to write the report. Only this time, the flavor of the night lingered, because I'd seen how close vanity and poison can lie on the same spoon. The brownstone had emptied of guests the night before, but the air still held their voices like smoke clinging to curtains. Fritz moved around the kitchen with the briskness of a man cleansing sacrilege from sacred ground, banging pans and muttering about saffron wasted on wickedness. Wolfe had retreated to the orchids after his final pronouncement, leaving me to tidy the battlefield. By morning, when the first pale sun stretched across the windows, the storm seemed to have passed. But I knew better. Cases with Wolfe never ended cleanly at the door. They lingered like the aftertaste of garlic. Wolfe didn't emerge from the plant rooms until nearly noon. He came down the stairs in his yellow silk, moving with the gravity of a man descending from Olympus. He sank into his chair without a word and reached for the beer Fritz had waiting. Only after the second swallow did he speak. "Archie, sit. We must complete the tableau." I sat, notebook open. Wolfe studied the ceiling as though it bore hieroglyphics. "Miss Vance has been removed, yes, but her arrest is only the intermission. For the truth to be accepted, it must be performed. Tonight we will gather them once more, Inspector Kramer included, and I shall articulate the sequence entire. There must be no ambiguity, no refuge of denial. Only clarity, as precise as a chef's knife." "Another gathering?" I asked. "We only just swept the last crumbs from the rug." "Phooey," Wolfe said. "That was disruption. Tonight will be resolution." So the afternoon was spent on arrangements. I telephoned Ashcroft, who nearly choked at the prospect of returning to the brownstone. He blustered until I reminded him that Wolfe had saved him from ruination twice already. Then the critics, the restaurateurs, even Victor Dane. Reluctant, wary, but curiosity is a stronger leash than fear. By dusk, they had all agreed. Kramer, grumbling, promised to bring Vance and Jules under escort. When the evening came, the office once again became a theater. Wolfe sat enthroned behind his desk, Fritz stationed at the door like a ceremonial guard. I had the pleasure of directing the seating. Ashcroft twitching near the globe, Dane scowling by the bookshelf, critics muttering among themselves. Vance entered with calm poise, notebook clutched like a dagger, though her wrists bore the faint red marks of Kramer's cuffs. Jules trailed after her, sullen and beaten, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. The murmur subsided as Wolfe cleared his throat. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. The cadence alone was enough to command. "You return," he said, "because disorder must be resolved. You each played a role, whether by design or by ignorance, in an attempted desecration of food and civilization alike. Tonight you will hear the truth entire, and Inspector Kramer will take the necessary action." Kramer grunted, but stayed put. Wolfe folded his hands. The midnight banquet was chosen as stage because of its notoriety. Mr. Ashcroft, in his vanity, gathers the city's palate in one room, seeking applause not for cuisine but for himself. That vanity is irresistible to a saboteur who craves spectacle. The anonymous letter you received was the first movement, melodramatic, juvenile. It was meant not to deter you, but to ensure you proceeded, trembling, into the trap. Ashcroft tried to protest, but Wolfe raised one finger, silencing him. The waiter, armed with a vial of cyanide, was the second movement. He was selected for his gullibility, his eagerness to believe he struck for justice, but his true purpose was not to succeed. It was to fail and to be caught. His capture gave the appearance of prevention, while ensuring suspicion spread like mold through the banquet hall. The critics shifted uncomfortably. Wolfe's gaze swept over them like a searchlight. The third movement was more refined. Jules, long trusted by Ashcroft, was suborned. Through him, poisoned saffron entered the kitchens. Its unveiling at the tasting would have collapsed critics at the table, destroying Ashcroft's last shred of legitimacy. But once again, the purpose was not slaughter. It was scandal. The real nourishment was not food, but ink and the hand that craved it. His eyes fixed on Eleanor Vance. "Was yours, Miss Vance?" The room drew a collective breath. Vance straightened, her smile thin but unbroken. "You mistake observation for orchestration," she said evenly. "No," Wolfe replied. "Your meetings with Jules were observed by Mr. Panzer. The envelopes you gave him bore your publisher's insignia. Your words recorded by Mr. Goodwin, confirm your intent. His fall will tell a better story. And your notes, photographed in your apartment, match precisely the phrases used in the anonymous letter. You did not wait for truth, you fabricated it. That is not journalism, that is authorship of crime. Vance's composure wavered. For the first time, her pen slipped from her fingers. Jules shifted in his chair, face buried in his hands. Victor Dane let out a bark of laughter. So the mighty critic is just another hack with poison in her purse. Wolfe cut him off with a glare. Silence, Mr. Dane. You too are culpable. Your venomous letters fed her narrative. Your bitterness gave her ammunition. You were not her architect, but you were her chorus. Dane flushed crimson and subsided. Wolfe leaned back, voice dropping to its final cadence. Understand this. Food is not mere sustenance. It is culture, order, civilization. To poison food is to poison trust itself. Miss Vance, you sought not merely to ruin a man, but to tarnish the very act of dining. That is why I intervened. That is why you sit here tonight, exposed. The silence was total. Even Kramer's cigar went cold. At last, the inspector rose, snapping his cuffs shut on Vance's wrists. She didn't resist. She only lifted her chin, eyes burning, and said, "Every downfall deserves its storyteller." Wolfe's lip curled. "And every storyteller, Miss Vance, deserves her own epitaph. Yours will be written in ink of shame." She was led out. Jules followed, shoulders slumped, a puppet with strings cut. Ashcroft sagged in his chair, sweat pouring down his temples. "You saved me again," he whispered hoarsely. Wolfe dismissed him with a flick of the hand. "Puis, I saved food. You're incidental." The guests filed out, muttering, shaken. Kramer gave Wolfe a curt nod, half respect, half resignation, then tramped away with his prisoners. When the brownstone was quiet once more, Fritz appeared with dinner. Roast duck, potatoes crisped to perfection, a sauce that shimmered like silk. Wolfe inhaled deeply, finally allowing himself the comfort he had postponed for days. "Archie," he said, lifting his fork, "remember, appetite unmasks the soul. Vanity, envy, ambition, they reveal themselves most plainly at the table. Miss Vance mistook her appetite for destiny, and thus she is consumed." He ate. I closed my notebook, leaned back, and let the peace return. Another case, another night, and another reminder that the brownstone, once disturbed, always restored itself. The quiet after a storm has its own weight, heavier sometimes than the thunder itself. The brownstone was still. Too still, the only sounds the faint rattle of Fritz moving in the kitchen and the creak of Wolfe's chair as he leaned back, eyes shut, letting the silence wash over him. I was at my desk, flipping through my notes, and for once, even I didn't feel much like filling the air with chatter. What we'd just pulled off wasn't a routine caller. It was Wolfe staging his own performance, every word as measured as a chef's pinch of salt, and watching Eleanor Vance finally crack had left the kind of aftertaste that doesn't rinse out with coffee. The orchids upstairs were probably getting more attention than I was, but that was fine. Wolfe only spoke once an hour had passed, and even then it came out more like a sigh than a declaration. "The grotesquerie," he said, "was not the poison, but the arrogance. A woman who sought to inscribe her vanity upon the very act of dining. Puis." He opened his eyes, fixing me. "We must not underestimate the appetite for infamy, Archie. It is more insatiable than hunger itself." I scribbled that down, not because I thought it would end up in a report, but because it was pure Wolfe, pompous, precise, and absolutely right. Late afternoon brought a visit from Kramer. He arrived in his usual hurricane of cigar smoke and bad temper, but under it was the grudging respect he never liked to show. He slammed his hat on my desk and barked. "Vance cracked this morning, admitted enough to make it easy for the DA. Your fat boss called it again." I leaned back. Don't sound so shocked. You've seen this movie before. Kramer grunted. I'll give him this. He saved Ashcroft's skin. Not that I'd have minded if the pompous fool got roasted a little. He jabbed his cigar in Wolfe's direction. But you, big man, you walk a line. You could have let us build the case. Instead, you put on a show in your parlor. Wolfe didn't even blink. Inspector, I did not put on a show. I ended one. Miss Vance's spectacle was already in rehearsal. I merely cut the curtain at the proper time. Kramer blew smoke and muttered something about philosophers belonging in padded cells. He gathered his hat, stomped out, and left the brownstone as calm as he'd entered loud. When the door closed, Wolfe allowed himself one of those deep, satisfied breaths he usually saves for sauerbraten. Kramer is a blunt man, he said, but even blunt men appreciate sharp edges, however unwillingly. The next few days unfolded with the slow rhythm that always follows a case. Reporters came sniffing, but Wolfe refused them entry. Fritz cooked elaborate meals as if to scrub the memory of saffron and cyanide from his repertoire. Saul dropped by once, giving me a bare nod, and Wolfe a 3-word confirmation. Jules won't talk. That suited Wolfe. He had already moved beyond Jewel, as though the man had never existed except as a pawn. Ashcroft sent a crate of vintage wine as thanks, which Wolfe rejected without a second thought. I will not accept tribute from a man whose vanity nearly toppled civilization's table, he declared. Fritz and I enjoyed the bottles anyway, strictly in the name of housekeeping, of course. But the real capstone came a week later, when the evening calm returned to the brownstone like a cat finding its favorite chair. Wolfe was on his 7th beer, Fritz had delivered pheasant under glass, and I had finally caught up on the mountain of paperwork Kramer kept tossing our way. The world outside buzzed with fresh scandals, new headlines, the eternal churn. But in here, the case of the midnight banquet had settled into memory, ready to be filed alongside the rest. It was Wolfe who broke the silence. He set his fork down with deliberate grace and said, Archie, you will note this case as an example of appetite metastasized. Not hunger, not ambition, but the grotesque desire to author calamity. That is more dangerous than any blade, for it corrupts perception itself. You should write an editorial, I said, or maybe start your own column. Call it The Fat Man's Guide to Civilization. He shot me a look that could curdle milk. I leave the frivolity to you. My concern is order. Miss Vance believed she could feed chaos into the city's mouth and call it truth. She was mistaken. Civilization requires discipline, even in food. I couldn't argue with that, though I tried. Sure, but without a little chaos, we'd all choke on the same soup forever. Maybe she just over-seasoned her story. Pfui, Wolfe snapped. Seasoning enhances. She spoiled. And with that, he turned back to his pheasant. Conversation closed. Later that night, I sat at my desk, filing the last of the notes. The brownstone was quiet again, the kind of quiet that lets you believe the world outside can't touch you. Wolfe upstairs with his orchids, Fritz polishing copper in the kitchen, me with my typewriter and the faint smell of beer lingering in the air. Another case solved, another villain unmasked, another reminder that in Wolfe's world, the sanctity of food and the order of logic stand above all else. But I'll admit this much. Watching Vance in that chair, her smile cracking under Wolfe's words, I felt a chill, because she wasn't wrong about one thing. Every downfall does need a storyteller. Wolfe gave her downfall. I guess that makes me the storyteller. The difference is, I don't lace my stories with poison. I just make sure the truth gets its proper seasoning. The brownstone settles into its rhythms the way a river finds its course, and after a case like the midnight banquet, those rhythms are almost a luxury. Fritz clattered in the kitchen with renewed vigor, testing sauces, muttering about balance and integrity, as if he needed to cleanse the very idea of food from the taint of Vance's theatrics. Wolfe resumed his orchids at 9 and his beer at 11, the pattern restored as though it had never bent. But even in that routine there was residue, and I could feel it clinging to the place the way garlic lingers long after dinner's done. The papers did their part. Vance's arrest filled columns, splashed across front pages. Some called it a fall from grace, others a tragic waste of talent. A few even painted her as a martyr for artistic truth. Wolfe read none of it, of course, except for the reviews of a new cookbook that landed on his desk. But I read enough to see the world doing what it always does, chewing on scandal until the flavor's gone. Ashcroft wasn't so lucky. He tried to spin the story, casting himself as victim and survivor, but the stain clung. His critics circled, his rivals pounced, and within a week invitations to his next event were being declined. He'd survive. Men like Ashcroft always do, but the crown he wore in the dining halls of Manhattan had lost its shine. Wolfe showed no interest. A man who mistakes vanity for culture will always topple under his own weight, he said when I mentioned it. Jules, meanwhile, had folded completely. His confessions tied him to Vance, though Wolfe had already cut that string. A servant who betrays his post for coin, he said, is not a mystery, but a monotony. He will fade into the shadows where such men belong. For me, it was the lull that always follows a storm. No tales to run, no midnight errands, no threats to untangle. Just the hum of the typewriter as I caught up on records, the sound of Wolfe's chair creaking under his bulk, and Fritz fussing over cutlets in the kitchen. Peaceful, sure, but peace in the brownstone never lasts. That Thursday, I came into the office with the morning paper and found Wolfe already awake, beer in hand. He was staring not at the paper but at the window, as if the city outside offended him more than usual. "Archie," he said without turning, "the appetite for ruin is infinite." "Good morning to you too," I said, dropping the paper on his desk. "Page 2's got Ashcroft being roasted again. Critics say his empire's crumbling." "As it should," Wolfe muttered. His empire was founded not on cuisine but on spectacle. He invited parasites to his table and wondered why they bit. He shifted, adjusting himself in the chair. "Miss Vance will spend years incarcerated. She will write no columns, stage no dramas. But the truth, Archie, the truth remains. Vanity is the most corrosive poison. It destroyed her, it diminished Ashcroft, and it nearly profaned food itself. We preserved order, but only narrowly." "Sounds like you're writing her obituary," I said. "Pooh! She will write her own, one sentence at a time, each line a testament to squandered talent. That is punishment enough." The day drifted by, slow and deliberate. Wolfe dictated letters, Fritz prepared a dinner of trout almondine, and I let the typewriter chatter out the final report. By evening, the house was as it had always been, steady, enclosed, protected. But I couldn't help replaying Vance's face when Wolfe laid her out in front of everyone, her poise cracking, her pen slipping. She had walked into the brownstone thinking it was her stage, and Wolfe turned her into a footnote. Dinner that night was a quiet affair. Wolfe ate with unusual focus, savoring each bite. When the plates were cleared, he leaned back with his glass of beer and gave the final word, the kind he only delivers when he feels the curtain truly closed. "Archie, consider this. Appetite is the purest mirror. In what we crave, we reveal ourselves. Miss Vance craved infamy, Mr. Ashcroft craved adulation, and Jules craved coin. All poisoned themselves with their own desires. Appetite, unchecked, becomes destruction. Civilization requires restraint." He raised his glass, amber liquid catching the light. "To restraint." I lifted mine, though mine was water. "And to Fritz's trout, which had just enough almonds and no cyanide." Wolfe allowed the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, which in his world counts as laughter. The brownstone returned to its silence, the case filed away, the world outside roaring on. And me? I went back to my desk, ready to type the closing line, the one Wolfe would never write, but that belonged to me. Because in the end, every downfall needs a storyteller. Wolfe may cut the threads, but I'm the one who weaves them into a tale worth telling. By the time I got back from a trip across town to collect some files Wolfe had demanded from a very reluctant source, the brownstone felt like a pressure cooker on low heat. Not boiling, not whistling, but steady and inevitable. Fritz was quieter than usual in the kitchen, moving pots and pans with less clatter, which was his way of registering that something weighty was in the air. The orchids upstairs had been watered, trimmed, and cosseted earlier than their schedule dictated, which meant Wolfe had been impatient enough to seek refuge among them before noon. I knew then that the pieces he'd been arranging, like ingredients lined up before Fritz began cooking, were finally set. All that was left was Wolfe himself to strike the match. I walked into the office, tossed my hat on the rack, and settled in my chair across from his. Wolfe was there, of course, planted in the big yellow chair, his bulk framed like an immovable statue of appetite and authority. His eyes were closed, but I knew better than to think he was napping. Wolfe never slept in that chair when a case was reaching its crest. His lips twitched slightly, as if words were being tasted and rejected before they made it to air. "You're timing yourself," I said, pulling out my notebook. "Practicing the monologue. I hope you leave room for an audience. They'll want a word in edgewise." He didn't bother opening his eyes. "Imbecile, I'm rehearsing the cadence of reason. A truth, Archie, is a dish that requires precise seasoning. Too much salt and it burns. Too little and it is tasteless. The proper proportion must be weighed before it is served." "Well, I hope you'll excuse me if I bring a fork and knife," I said. "Your audience won't be orchids, and some of them may have sharper tongues than you've planned for." Now he did open his eyes, fixing me with the kind of look that usually meant I'd walked too far across the line of jest. "Archie, there is no sharper tongue than reason. It cuts all others down to silence." That was my cue that he was ready. The suspects would be summoned, the chairs arranged in front of his desk. He would stay in that chair, immovable, while the rest of us, Fritz with refreshments, me with questions, Saul ready if needed, were the pieces on his board. But Wolfe, he was always the one moving them. I leaned forward. "Then tell me this. What's the play? You've had me running around, chasing recipes and scribbles, peering at notes left on menus and talking to chefs who'd rather stab me with a carving fork than answer. You've got something, Wolfe, or else you wouldn't be vibrating in that chair like a man who smelled Fritz's chocolate torte." A small grunt escaped him, half acknowledgement, half irritation. "Patience. You will have your place soon enough. Tonight, they will all be here." That meant everyone. Ashcroft with his smooth words and jittery hands. Layla Vance, who'd gone from smiling predator to cornered cat in less than a week. Jules, whose weakness had been useful, but not nearly enough to disguise his duplicity. And perhaps one or two others whose presence wasn't required, but would serve Wolfe's purposes in demonstration. He gestured toward the desk. "Telephone. Call Mr. Ashcroft first. Inform him that tonight, at 8 o'clock precisely, he is to attend here with no delay. Inform him the others will be present, and his absence will be taken as confession." I raised an eyebrow. "That'll shake him like a champagne bottle. He'll bluster, you know." "Let him. Bluster is wind, and wind cannot overturn a mountain." I made the call, and sure enough, Ashcroft's voice was syrup over grit. He tried to maneuver around me, but Wolfe's message was short and sharp. He agreed, though his tone cracked more than once. "One down." Next was Vance. She answered with icy calm, but I could hear the undertow beneath it, like a piano string stretched too tight. Wolfe's demand landed, and she hesitated long enough to make me wonder if she'd slam the receiver down. But she didn't. She whispered something I couldn't catch and then said she'd be there. 2 down. Jules was easier. He stammered through excuses until I threatened that Wolfe would make his excuses public if he didn't appear. He folded like yesterday's laundry. By the time the last core was done, Wolfe had leaned back again, eyes closed, fingers steepled. His satisfaction filled the room without him needing to say a word. That night, Fritz set out the chairs in neat rows facing Wolfe's desk. The office had a different air when it was prepared like that. Less home, more courtroom. The globes shone dully under the lamp. The books lined the walls in silent testimony, and Wolfe's chair was the bench, the dais, the throne. I'd seen it before, but it never failed to strike me how completely he could turn that room into a stage. At 7:30, I poured myself a drink and stood by the door. Wolfe, of course, was already seated, a glass of beer within easy reach. The weight of expectation settled in like the smell of cigars in the air. At 8 sharp, the bell rang. One by one they filed in. Ashcroft first, smiling but pale, sweat glistening at his hairline. Vance next, composed but with eyes too bright. Jules last, trembling, his hands twisting like dough. Each took their chair, and Wolfe didn't say a word until they were settled. When he did, his voice was low and calm, but it filled the space like a bass note. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have intruded upon my house, sullied the sanctity of food, and presumed upon civility. Tonight you will answer for it. I'm not the law. I'm not the press. I'm only a man who will not abide corruption. Yet I will see truth restored here." They shifted in their seats, eyes darting, throats tightening. Wolfe's eyes moved from one to the next, slow and steady. "You have each deceived, each hidden, but the pattern is whole, and the author of this conspiracy stands revealed. I will name them presently." The room seemed to tighten like a drumhead, and I knew, as always, that Wolfe was about to slice through it with the kind of precision no one else on earth could match. And there I was, Archie Goodwin, perched on the edge of my chair with a pencil in hand, knowing that once again we were on the edge of revelation, and Wolfe was about to pull the veil away, smooth and merciless. The silence in the office was thick enough to chew. The three of them sat in their chairs as if they were waiting to be measured for coffins, and Wolfe, naturally, leaned back in his yellow throne like a magistrate considering whether justice was worth the effort. I stayed by the wall, notebook ready, though I had no doubt how this would play. I'd seen it too many times. The suspects thinking they were on equal footing with Wolfe, only to discover he'd already dug the floor out from under them. Ashcroft tried to lead off with charm. "Mr. Wolfe, surely this little performance isn't necessary. I've explained to your assistant." "Phooey," Wolfe cut him off, the sound like a gavel striking. "You have explained nothing. You have only obfuscated, as is your nature. But obfuscation, Mr. Ashcroft, is like seasoning. It can only disguise the dish for so long before its essence emerges." Ashcroft shut his mouth, and his fingers twitched against the arm of his chair. Layla Vance leaned forward, her eyes flashing. "And what essence do you claim to have uncovered, Mr. Wolfe? That chefs gossip, that critics have egos, that restaurants sometimes play politics?" "Sit back, Miss Vance," Wolfe said evenly. "Your desperation leaks through your voice. Archie, note that." I scribbled in the notebook, though mostly for effect. Wolfe didn't need my shorthand. He needed the weight of the act. Jules shifted uncomfortably, and Wolfe's gaze drifted to him like a hawk sighting a mouse. "And you, Jules, you who thought betrayal could be hidden under servility. You betrayed more than an employer. You betrayed food, and that is intolerable." I didn't mean," Jules stammered, but Wolfe raised a hand and the words dried in his throat. "You each played your part," Wolfe continued. "Mr. Ashcroft with his grand banquets designed not for cuisine but for display, for profit, for vanity. Miss Vance, with her pen dipped in venom, not ink, her criticism sharpened into weapons for personal vendettas. Jules, with his petty thefts and whispered leaks, selling scraps of information like so much offal. Together you conspired, whether consciously or not, to degrade the very essence of culinary art. Ashcroft barked a laugh, thin and brittle. Conspired? That's absurd. I threw a dinner. She wrote an article. He ran errands. Where's the conspiracy in that? Wolfe's eyes narrowed. The conspiracy lies in the poisoned plate. That landed like a cleaver on a cutting board. Vance stiffened. Jules' eyes darted. Ashcroft's face drained. Yes, Wolfe said softly, savoring the weight of it. The plate meant for you, Mr. Ashcroft, the plate that carried more than garnish. Cyanide. It was no accident, no mischief. It was intention. The silence stretched until you could hear the faint tick of the wall clock. And who, Ashcroft croaked, do you accuse of such intention? Wolfe shifted his massive shoulders, drawing himself up an inch. Miss Vance. Her breath caught, sharp as glass. You dare. I do more than dare, Wolfe interrupted. I reason. You wish to humiliate Ashcroft, to destroy his empire, and elevate yourself as the critic who had finally toppled the so-called king. But humiliation was not enough. You sought a spectacle, a scandal so grand it would echo across the dining rooms of New York. Poison at a banquet, what better symbol of your thesis, that cuisine had become corrupt and decadent? Who better than you, the self-styled scourge of indulgence, to expose it? Only you overreached. You relied on Jules to tamper with the menu, to place the plate, but Jules betrayed you as he betrayed everyone. Jules broke then, his voice shaking. She promised it would only be for show, that no one would die, that it would be traced, discovered, and Ashcroft would be ruined. Vance's face went pale, then crimson. Lies. He lies. Silence, Wolfe commanded. The word hit with the force of a verdict. You will not contaminate this room further. Archie. That was my cue. I stepped forward, pulling from my pocket the slip Wolfe had instructed me to secure that morning. A fragment of paper, torn from Vance's notebook. The ink, unmistakable. A menu annotated with her hand, the word plate circled and the mark beside Ashcroft's name. I held it up. Fritz found this in the trash, tucked under a pile of onion skins. Not Fritz's hand, not Jules's. Yours. Vance's composure cracked. She gripped the arms of her chair, knuckles white, eyes darting between us like a cornered animal. It wasn't supposed to. Wolfe's voice cut through, low and implacable. It was meant, Miss Vance. You sought to poison reputation, but in doing so you embraced poison itself. That is your undoing. Ashcroft let out a long, shaky breath. You see, it was never me. I was the victim. Pfui, Wolfe snapped. You are no victim. You are culpable in your vanity, complicit in your negligence. You invited wolves to your table and fattened them on arrogance. Your empire crumbles not because of Miss Vance's treachery alone, but because you built it on air. Ashcroft sank back, chastened, though not repentant. Wolfe drew himself taller, his voice resonant. This house has been disturbed long enough. You will leave it now. The law will attend to the rest. Archie will provide the authorities with the necessary evidence. The reckoning of appetite and vanity has been served. They rose, slow and shaken, each carrying their ruin like a cloak. Ashcroft muttering about slander, Jules near tears, Vance silent, her face carved from stone. I ushered them out, one by one, until the brownstone was quiet again. When I returned, Wolfe was leaning back, eyes closed, the tension gone from his frame. He reached for his beer, sipped, and let out a satisfied sigh. Fritz may serve dinner now, he said. And just like that, it was over. Another conspiracy unraveled, another storm weathered, and the sanctity of the brownstone restored. Wolfe had not moved from his chair, yet he'd toppled an empire, exposed a schemer, and restored order to the world of cuisine, all without raising his voice above a growl. I sat back at my desk, pen scratching out the final notes, thinking that for all the bluster, all the schemes, all the poisoned plates and poisoned egos, it always came down to Wolfe in that chair, and me watching the pieces fall. The world outside could have its banquets and scandals. In here, dinner was served, order was kept, and Wolfe remained immovable. And me? I made sure the record was clear, sharp, and just witty enough that when future generations dug it out, they'd know exactly how it felt to be in that room when Wolfe turned the truth into a feast no one could forget. The brownstone, once emptied of intruders, seemed to inhale and restore itself. The air grew lighter without Ashcroft's bluster, Vance's venom, or Jules' nervous whimpers. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was dignified again, like the hush in a library after the door closes. Fritz emerged from the kitchen, expression carefully neutral, though I caught the flicker of relief in his eyes. He lived for the sanctity of this house as much as Wolfe did, and the night's spectacle had rattled him. "Dinner in 20 minutes," he said. His voice carried the same steady assurance as always, but I could tell he'd put an extra hand into the seasoning, as if the food itself could serve as a benediction. I leaned against the desk, notebook in hand, watching Wolfe. He hadn't moved since delivering his judgment. His hands rested on the arms of the chair, fingers spread like roots of a tree. His eyes closed. To anyone else, he might have looked half asleep, but I knew better. He was savoring, in his way, the restoration of order. "Another curtain call, another ovation," I said. "Though I don't think Ashcroft will be sending you flowers. More likely a writ." Wolfe opened his eyes slowly, as though humoring the world. "Archie, pfui. Ashcroft will do nothing. His vanity has been eviscerated. A man without vanity is a man without teeth. He is harmless now." "And Vance?" I asked. She didn't strike me as the type to fade quietly into the night. "She has been unmasked," Wolfe replied. "Her weapon was her pen, her influence, her posture as arbiter of taste. Without credibility, those weapons are ash. She may write, but her words will find no purchase. She may scheme, but without trust, her schemes will crumble. She has been sentenced already, by truth itself." I tapped the notebook with my pencil. "And Jules? You know the police will squeeze him until he sings every tune he knows. Do we care what becomes of him?" Wolfe grunted, closing his eyes again. "He is dross. His betrayal was trivial compared to the corruption of the others. The law will dispose of him suitably. He does not warrant my concern." I shrugged. "Well, you've tied it all in a neat ribbon. Not bad for a night's work without lifting yourself out of that chair." His eyes opened again, glinting with irritation. "Archie, do not trivialize. This was not a parlor game. Poison was placed on a plate. Reputation, livelihood, and perhaps lives were endangered. To restore order, one must peel away the layers of deceit until only truth remains. That requires discipline, not exertion. Physical exertion is the occupation of oxen." That was Wolfe at his fullest, lecturing me while sipping beer, equating truth with cuisine and corruption with rot. But beneath the bluster, I caught the flicker of satisfaction. Cases like this nourished him as surely as Fritz's duckling in orange sauce. The bell rang just then, startling me enough to nearly drop my pencil. Wolfe growled low, but I hurried to the door. Inspector Kramer stood there, hat tilted back, cigar clamped between his teeth. He smelled like a mix of tobacco and rain. "Well, Goodwin," he said, brushing past me without waiting for an invitation. "I hear you and your boss had yourselves a little dinner theater. Mind if I collect the bill?" "Write this. Way," I said, leading him into the office. "You missed the show. Best seat in the house was right there." I pointed at Wolfe, who hadn't so much as twitched. Kramer's eyes narrowed. "Wolfe, you've handed me another fine mess, haven't you?" "I have handed you," Wolfe said, voice low and deliberate, "the perpetrators of conspiracy, the evidence of their guilt, and the outline of their motives. If that is a mess, Inspector, then I suggest you revise your definition of cleanliness." Kramer snorted, dropping into one of the empty chairs. "Always a pleasure. Well, I'll take them off your hands. The DA will like the poison angle. It'll make headlines. But don't expect me to send a thank you basket." "I expect nothing," Wolfe said. "Your presence is an unfortunate necessity. Archie will provide you with the documents and evidence. You may depart when satisfied." Kramer muttered under his breath, but I knew better than to ask him to repeat it. I handed over the slip of paper from Vance's notebook, Jules' confession, and a neat outline Wolfe had dictated earlier. Kramer skimmed them, puffing smoke, then tucked them into his coat. "All right," he said finally. "We'll take it from here. But one of these days, Wolfe, I'll catch you without your little assistant running interference." "You will not," Wolfe replied, closing his eyes again. Kramer grumbled, jammed his hat back on, and left in a swirl of cigar smoke. When the door closed, Wolfe exhaled a long sigh. At last. Fritz appeared moments later with a tray bearing platters of trout, new potatoes, and asparagus. The aroma filled the room, clean and restorative. Wolfe leaned forward, his hands finally moving as he arranged his napkin. "Archie," he said as Fritz set the table, "remember this. Appetite is the mirror of the soul. In what a man chooses to consume or to poison, he reveals himself utterly. Vance consumed vanity until it destroyed her. Ashcroft consumed admiration until it soured into ridicule. Jules consumed scraps of coin until he became refuse. Appetite unchecked leads always to ruin." I poured myself a glass of water and sat across from him. "And you, Wolfe? What does your appetite say about you?" He lifted his fork, eyes narrowing slightly. "That I demand excellence. That I will not tolerate corruption of food, of reason, or of order. Appetite, properly disciplined, sustains civilization. Without it, we are brutes." He took a bite of trout, chewed slowly, swallowed, and closed his eyes in satisfaction. "This," he murmured, "is civilization." I grinned, scribbling the line down in my notebook. "Fine, Wolfe. But civilization also needs someone to write it up, or else no one will believe it happened. You've got your philosophy, Fritz has his sauces, and me. I'll make sure the story's told, with just enough seasoning to keep it from tasting too much like spinach." Wolfe opened one eye, regarding me with disdain. "Archie, must you cheapen everything with levity?" "Sure," I said. "It keeps the world from choking on all that civilization." His grunt was drowned by the clink of cutlery, the room settling back into its rhythm. Outside, New York roared with its endless hungers. Money, fame, survival. Inside, the brownstone was once again inviolate, protected by the appetite and intellect of Nero Wolfe, and by me, his reluctant chronicler, making sure the record had bite. And that was the end of the midnight banquet. Order restored, appetite sated, and Wolfe still in his chair, immovable as ever.